Hello, pilots, and welcome back to another episode of the Where to Fly podcast. Today's episode is going to be all about flying in fog. I want to extend that conversation to just flying in high moisture situations. So I would say like low hanging fog, snowfall. Probably not rain. That's kind of a separate question. But I wanted to talk about that. Talk about a few things. First, regulatory, like legal things. Are you even allowed to fly in fog? Are you allowed to fly in clouds? Secondly, I want to talk about how you can protect your drone and like what you might want to be concerned about if you're going to be flying in an area where there's a lot of moisture. Third, touching on something that I don't think a lot of people think about, but that's ice. Really only applicable in really cold air climates, especially if it's snowing. And then finally, your camera and just being able to see and not getting fogged up. So that's something we'll touch on at the end. But circling back to the beginning here, let's talk about the regulatory concerns when flying in fog. So a few things. First of all, you always need to be flying below the 400-foot ceiling. No matter what you're doing, that's the FAA's guidelines. So if you're flying in fog or clouds below that, that's what we're talking about here. Now, the biggest concern, the biggest thing to worry about when flying in fog and flying in clouds is that you have a visual line of sight on your drone. And that is basically the only regulation or stipulation that the FAA has at this point. There's no rules so far saying like, oh, you can't fly in fog, you can't fly in moisture, you can't fly in clouds, as long as you can see the drone. And then this is probably where it gets a little bit more hazy as to like what constitutes being able to see your drone. And different people will argue different things. I think that the way that I interpret the law is, if I can see the drone, tell what the orientation is, be able to control the drone without looking at the camera, that is visual line of sight to me. Some people would say you can have a spotter, keeping an eye on the drone. You don't yourself need to be able to see the drone. I think it's a little hazy. The interesting thing is there really hasn't been many lawsuits to create any precedent for the situation. So we really don't know for sure, but I think, just use your most common sense and go from there in terms of what you think visual line of sight is. Something that can be really helpful though in establishing visual line of sight is understanding the lights on your drone. So a lot of drones, like DJI drones, you might have different colored lights, like green for the front, green for the back, red for the front, red for the back. So understand what color lights you have on your drones and where they are, and that can really help you, especially in fog when you're not that far away, but it might be a little bit hard to tell the orientation of your drone. That can be very beneficial. So with that out of the way, say you have line of sight on your drone, whatever you decide that looks like. Now I want to talk about protecting your drone. So whenever you're going to be flying in fog, you need to obviously think about the fact that there's a lot of moisture in the air. And speaking from personal experience, your drone can come back like dripping wet. Like you would think you just flew it in a rainstorm. And this is basically... There are a few things that I would be concerned about and a few things I wouldn't be concerned about. So firstly, brushless motors themselves actually are waterproof. Like you can put a brushless motor in water and nothing will happen to it. It's not, maybe it'll get corroded if you put it in salt water, but the water itself does not damage a brushless motor, which I think some people don't quite understand. It's just it's just a magnet and some coils. So there's nothing to be concerned about there. What you do want to be concerned about is basically everything else. Everything else in the drone shouldn't really get wet. And newer drones, I know the Inspire 2 has dust proof and waterproofing, so you can fly it in light rain and stuff like that. But I'm talking about drones that don't. Specifically flying the Phantom range, a Phantom 3, for example. I'm just going to be speaking with my personal experience. What I have found if I'm going to be flying a situation where there's a lot of moisture, maybe it's snowing or there's a lot of fog, I'll tape up the ports. I was concerned initially that I might have overheating, but what I found is it's generally pretty cold whenever it's foggy, or it's generally, especially if it's snowing, it's going to be cold enough that you really shouldn't have to worry too much about the drone overheating. But I would say experiment and just be aware that you're covering up the ventilation, and that could kind of cause your drone to overheat if you're flying in a warm climate. But as long as it's cool enough, I'd recommend taping the top ports of the drone that allow for ventilation, because directly underneath that is your ESC, or electronic speed controller, and those are pretty susceptible to moisture, and though they are generally shrink wrapped and covered and protected, that's something that you would be concerned about getting wet, and then basically anything else inside the drone. But from my experience, I've flown in fog and had my drone come back dripping wet. I've dried it off and it's flown fine after the fact. And I've done this, gosh, probably 5 or 6 times. So that's just my personal experience. Obviously, use your own judgment. I'm sure there's a line where, the drone just won't be able to handle it. But that would be my suggestion. Try and tape up any ports, basically, that let water into the center of the drone. Now, the third thing we're going to talk about here is icing. So I actually didn't even think about this until I was on a forum. This is a little while ago, because I was flying and I started to lose lift. And I was like, gosh, that's super weird. And then I was thinking, could this be icing? I know there's icing is a concern when you have, large airplanes. And they're flying and it's really cold and you can start building up ice on the leading edge of in this case, the propeller. And what happens then is it disturbs the airflow, obviously over the foil, and you lose lift. So basically what happens is, because the blade's spinning so fast, in this instance, I was actually flying in a snowstorm. Probably would not recommend it, but it ended up being fine for me. But I was flying in a snowstorm, and when the snow was landing on the propeller, it was a very, very warm storm, so the snow was very wet and heavy. And I think what was basically happening is, because the propeller was spinning so fast, the wind chill around the drone itself was very cold, so the snow was starting to freeze on the props. So I started to lose lift, and it was getting lower and lower, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is very odd. Come to land the drone and check it out, and there's just a little bit of ice forming. So that's something to be aware of. I think it really only happens in rare situations where it's going to be high moisture and very cold. So I would say almost exclusively in the snow. In fog and clouds, I really wouldn't be too concerned, but just something to keep an eye out if it is very, very cold wherever you're flying. Just make sure that, if you're losing lift, to bring it back, because that could be a problem with icing, which can actually be very dangerous if the drone falls. Okay, the fourth and final main topic I wanted to touch on, when flying in fog, when flying in clouds, basically anywhere where you have a lot of moisture, is your camera and being able to see with your camera. So as I touched on, you should always have visual line of sight, per the FAA's regulations. That's just the law. But you still might find it helpful to be able to see with your camera. At least I find it extraordinarily helpful when I'm able to see with my camera, see my surroundings, and fly using both the line of sight that I have of my drone and also what my drone is seeing itself. And this can actually be really challenging when you're flying in fog, because I'm not sure if any of you yourselves have done this already, but your camera will just fog up almost instantly. So I would say that's something to be prepared for. And if the fog is thin enough, maybe you don't need to worry about it. If it's thin enough or low enough where you can fly your drone above the fog and still see your drone, I would say this is a pretty rare situation, but I've been, in fog that's kind of light and you can fly, 100 feet up, 200 feet up, and you can still see the drone, but it's just over a thin layer of fog. That's probably a great idea, because as soon as you're flying through fog and sitting in fog for too long, the moisture that gets on the camera lens basically makes it impossible to see. So that's something to keep in mind. First of all, you probably aren't going to be able to get great video or photos if that's your goal. And then second of all, it can be pretty dangerous, because say you do lose line of sight, you at that point basically can't see your drone, because even though you have a video signal back, it's very possible that all you're seeing is kind of gray and white fuzz, and you're not seeing much else besides that. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. So those are just kind of a few of the things that I have noticed myself when flying in fog, and I just thought I would throw out there. But just to recap, basically, is flying in fog legal? Yes, flying in fog, flying in clouds, there's nothing illegal about it. What you do need to be careful of is having line of sight on your drone. And I think that's where a lot of people maybe get confusing. Oh, you can't fly in fog, or you can't fly in clouds. Yeah, as soon as you lose line of sight, yeah, you cannot do that. And obviously you need to stay within all the regulations, besides that, staying outside of fly zones, below the flight ceiling, and all of that good stuff. But flying in fog itself, flying in moisture, there's nothing illegal about that. As long as you can still see the drone. So those are just my thoughts. Like I said, I'd love to hear what you have to do, what your thoughts are on the subject. If you guys have flown in fog, what you found, if you'd recommend it, if you wouldn't recommend it. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you guys next time. All right, bye.